You've heard it. That phrase, toxic masculinity. They use it in headlines, they use it in classrooms, they use it in movies, news, and conversations, as if it's something you should apologize for, as if simply being a man is a problem that needs solving. But let me ask you something. Have you ever actually stopped and asked what it means? Not the definition that fits a hashtag, not the one shouted in debates, but the truth beneath it. Because maybe, just maybe, it isn't what you think. They say toxic masculinity like it's a diagnosis. But the disease they're describing, it isn't masculinity at all. It's confusion. It's shame. It's generations of men being told to be less of themselves until they don't even know who that is anymore. You see, they've done something clever. They took the very traits that built civilization, strength, stoicism, courage, discipline, and they twisted them, turned them into something dangerous, something to be feared. Now strength becomes aggression, confidence becomes arrogance, leadership becomes control, and suddenly, the things that once made a man valuable are labelled as toxic. But here's what no one tells you. That phrase wasn't born to shame you. It was created to help men understand the pain of living inside a broken mould. It was meant to separate healthy masculinity from the behaviours that hurt men themselves. But when it left the therapy rooms and entered the culture wars, it changed. The nuance vanished, and what was once a tool for healing became a weapon for blame. That's when the narrative shifted. The conversation wasn't about helping men anymore, it was about controlling them, because there's power in guilt, power in telling half the population that their nature is wrong. You can see it everywhere, in how boys are scolded for being loud, how fathers are mocked in commercials, how every expression of male energy is treated like a threat waiting to happen. It's not coincidence, it's conditioning. They tell you to be sensitive, but not too sensitive, to lead, but never too strongly, to be confident, but never proud. Every rule contradicts the last, and after a while, you stop trying to be anything at all. And that's the point. When a man loses his definition, he becomes easier to reshape, easier to manage, easier to silence. So, no, this isn't just about a label. It's about the quiet war on identity, on strength, on the fire inside every man that refuses to die quietly. Because the truth is, masculinity isn't toxic, but what they've done to it is. Section 2, the genesis of a term, the origins and irony. Before we talk about how the world weaponized it, you need to understand where the phrase toxic masculinity actually came from, because it didn't begin on Twitter. It didn't come from feminist blogs or college lectures. It began with men who were trying to heal. Back in the 1980s, long before hashtags and outrage campaigns, there was a quiet movement, the mythopoetic men's movement. Writers, psychologists and teachers like Shepard Bliss and Robert Blee gathered men together, not to blame them but to help them rediscover what it truly meant to be one. These men looked around at society and saw generations of sons raised without fathers, men hiding pain behind alcohol, men who had become mechanical, efficient, successful, but emotionally empty. They weren't talking about villains, they were talking about broken men, and they saw a pattern. They realized that some of the behaviors society encouraged, suppression of emotion, dominance at all costs, rejection of vulnerability, was slowly killing men from the inside out. So they gave those destructive patterns a name, not to condemn masculinity, but to separate the wounds from the virtues. Toxic masculinity, in its original form, was never an accusation. It was a diagnosis of pain, a map toward healing, a way to say, these parts of you, the anger, the isolation, the disconnection, they don't make you less of a man. They're just parts of you that were taught wrong. But the modern world doesn't like nuance, it likes outrage. And when that phrase left therapy circles and entered headlines, the context was erased, stripped of empathy, replaced with judgment. Soon toxic masculinity wasn't about healing men anymore, it was about humbling them. It became a soundbite, a weapon, a convenient way to point a finger without having to understand what's underneath. And men felt it. They didn't need anyone to explain the shift. They could feel the contempt in the tone, the sneer in the word masculine. It wasn't about behaviour anymore, it was about identity. The irony is brutal. A term created to help men open up was used to shut them down. A concept born from compassion was twisted into condemnation. The same world that once begged men to speak their truth now calls them fragile for doing it. The same society that claimed to want emotional men recoils when those emotions don't fit its narrative. And so the phrase became something else, a signal that says, we don't want to fix masculinity. We want to redefine it on our terms. What began as healing became humiliation, and the men who were supposed to be saved by it instead learned to stay silent again. Section 3. The narrative takes hold, how it got twisted. Once the term left the hands of the men who created it, it was never the same again. What started as therapy became theatre. A healing tool became a headline. A quiet conversation between wounded men turned into a global accusation. It entered politics, pop culture, social media, and somewhere between all the noise, truth died, because the world doesn't care about accuracy, it cares about control. And a phrase like toxic masculinity was too powerful to leave untouched. Soon it became a weapon with no owner, a slogan people could throw into any argument without understanding what it meant. And the message was clear: you as a man are the problem. Movies started to rewrite male characters. The strong man became the villain, the father became a fool, the protector became an oppressor, and every image of manhood once admired became something to mock or dismantle. That's how the lie spread, quietly, beautifully, with just enough moral language to make it sound righteous. You see, when you control language, you control thought. When you change what words mean, you change what people feel guilty for. And soon masculinity itself became something men had to explain, justify, or hide. Young boys grew up afraid of their own instincts, afraid of being too much, afraid that their natural drive to compete, to lead, to protect would make them targets of criticism. And while the world celebrated empowerment, men started disappearing into silence, not because they didn't care, but because no one wanted to hear their side of the story anymore. Try expressing frustration and you're labelled angry. Try showing confidence and you're called arrogant. Try leading and you're accused of domination. Even empathy became suspect, because if you show kindness, they'll say you're doing it for validation. It's a trap, a perfect one. Every path a man takes leads to guilt, and guilt is the easiest leash to control someone with, because a guilty man will overcorrect. He'll shrink himself. He'll apologize for his nature, and the smaller he becomes, the safer everyone else feels, until one day he wakes up and realizes he's not a man anymore. He's a shadow, a careful imitation of what used to be powerful. That's how control works, not through force, but through shame. They didn't have to destroy masculinity. They just had to make men doubt it. And it worked for decades, until now. Because something inside men, that quiet, ancient instinct, is starting to wake up again. Not in anger, not in rebellion, but in realization. Section 4. The societal impact and backlash. The fallout. When you tell men that their nature is dangerous long enough, they start to believe it. They stop defending themselves. They stop speaking up. And eventually, they stop showing up. You can see the damage everywhere, if you know where to look. Empty chairs at dinner tables, silent phone calls that never happen. Fathers who love their sons but don't know how to talk to them anymore. Young men spending more time on screens than with real people, not because they're lazy, but because the world outside makes them feel like intruders. They call it progress. But what kind of progress silences an entire generation of men into shame? The irony is cruel. The toxic masculinity movement claimed to make men healthier, more open, more emotional, more human. But what it actually did was make them disappear. Now boys grow up confused, unsure of what the world even wants from them. They're told to be emotional, but when they cry, they're weak. They're told to be respectful, but when they hold the door open, it's patronizing. They're told to be strong, but when they act with conviction, it's oppressive. It's a maze with no exit. Every path leads to self-doubt, and the more confused men become, the easier it is to control them. That's why the silence isn't random, it's engineered. Because a man without confidence can't protect. A man without purpose won't lead, and a man without identity won't fight for truth. This is the hidden cost of the toxic masculinity narrative, not just to men but to society itself. Because when men retreat, everything collapses with them. Families lose anchors, communities lose builders, women lose protectors, children lose role models, and we're already seeing it. The rise in fatherless homes, the epidemic of male loneliness, the quiet desperation of men who look strong but feel empty inside. They call it a crisis of masculinity, but they never ask who created it. They talk about male violence but never about male despair. They analyze men's mistakes but never their pain, because pain doesn't sell, blame does. And so the narrative continues, each accusation building another wall between men and meaning, until one day someone looks around and realizes the men are gone. Not physically, they're still here, but emotionally, spiritually, they've checked out. The lights are on, but no one's home. And that's when society starts to crumble quietly, one disconnected man at a time. Section 5. Deconstructing the Construct. Truth versus label. Frontards. Here's the truth they don't want to talk about. Masculinity has never been the problem. The problem is the story told about it. They've built an illusion, a caricature of manhood that's easier to destroy than understand, because it's easier to say men are toxic than to ask why some men are broken. The truth is, masculinity isn't one thing. It's a spectrum of strength, discipline, compassion, control, and responsibility. It's the fire that builds as easily as it destroys, depending on who teaches you to wield it. But today, no one teaches men how. They only tell them not to burn. We don't teach boys that anger can become courage, that aggression when harnessed becomes protection, that stoicism isn't coldness, it's control, that pride in moderation becomes purpose. We strip those lessons away, and then we wonder why men grow up lost, disconnected, or destructive. It's like handing someone a sword and telling them never to use it, then blaming them when they cut themselves by accident. Masculinity isn't toxic. Untrained masculinity is. Unloved masculinity is. Ignored masculinity is. The label toxic masculinity takes everything men are capable of and throws it into one bucket, as if strength, aggression, power, or authority are inherently evil. They're not. They're neutral forces. They only become dangerous when stripped of guidance, wisdom, and love. A man who's never taught how to control his power will misuse it, but a man who's shamed for even having it will bury it. And a buried instinct doesn't disappear. It rots, it festers, and eventually it breaks out in ways that really are toxic. That's the great irony. In trying to eliminate toxic masculinity, they created more of it. Because you don't heal a man by shaming him. You don't fix strength by destroying it. You fix it by refining it, by teaching it purpose. If a man's aggression is trained, he becomes a protector. If his pride is guided, he becomes a leader. If his dominance is tempered by love, he becomes a foundation others can rely on. The world forgot that, and so men forgot themselves. Now, we live in a generation of disconnected men, not because they're inherently dangerous, but because they were never allowed to learn the balance between power and peace. The term toxic masculinity wasn't meant to divide, but that's what it became. A wall between men and the world, a label that hides pain behind politics. And maybe that was the point all along. Section 6, the conditioning. How society trained men to doubt themselves. None of this happened by accident. You don't convince millions of men to hate themselves overnight. You do it slowly, subtly, one generation at a time. It starts in childhood, in classrooms that reward obedience over courage. Boys are told to sit still, use their inside voice, stop roughhousing. But those traits, the energy, the competitiveness, the curiosity, they're not defects. They're the raw material of masculinity. When you punish those instincts, you don't create better men. You create confused ones. Then comes the media, the silent machine that never stops whispering. Every commercial, every show, every movie, it plants the same idea. Men are clumsy, insensitive, childish, replaceable. The strong ones are villains, the gentle ones are jokes, and the only acceptable man is the one who apologizes for being one. It's not storytelling, it's conditioning. Because the easiest way to control a man is to make him question his nature, to make him doubt the voice inside that says you were meant for more. So men start to shrink, they hide their opinions, they soften their tone, they act small, hoping to be accepted. They call it being respectful, but it's not respect. It's fear disguised as virtue, and it's everywhere. In workplaces where assertiveness is called aggression, in relationships where leadership is labeled control, in society where ambition is treated like arrogance unless it serves someone else's agenda. Every message tells men the same thing. You're too much, and the ones who listen, they become ghosts. They exist but they don't live. They move carefully through life, avoiding offense, avoiding risk, avoiding themselves. And here's the tragic part. The more men conform to this new model of acceptable masculinity, the more society resents them anyway. Because you can't respect what you've neutered. You can't admire what you've broken. So men are trapped, damned if they're strong, ignored if they're soft. And no one ever stops to ask the question that matters most. Who benefits from men being weak? Because every system, political, economic, cultural, thrives on control. And the one thing you can never control is a man who knows who he is. That's why this narrative survives. Not because it's true, but because it keeps men tame, predictable, safe. But men aren't meant to be safe. They're meant to be anchored, measured, protective, capable. That kind of man can't be manipulated, and that's exactly why the world keeps trying to erase him. Section 7. The Rebuild. What real masculinity truly is. After everything they've taken from men, their confidence, their image, their place in the world, something powerful is beginning to return. Quietly, unapologetically, without permission. Because truth doesn't need permission. It only needs to be remembered. Real masculinity was never about domination or silence. It was about direction. about standing still when everything around you falls apart, about taking responsibility when everyone else runs from it. Masculinity is the builder's hand, the father's protection, the soldier's resolve, the man who carries weight, not because he has to, but because someone has to. You don't see that on screens anymore. You don't hear it in conversations, because that kind of strength isn't marketable. It doesn't cry for attention. It doesn't tweet about virtue, it just is. And that's what terrifies the world most. The men who live with quiet conviction. Because you can't guilt a man who knows his worth. You can't shame a man who lives with purpose. You can't control a man who stands for something greater than himself. They can call it outdated. They can call it toxic. But the truth is simple. Masculinity is not the enemy of peace. It's the protector of it. It's the presence that holds the line when everything else collapses. It's the discipline that keeps chaos in check. It's the self-control that turns instinct into honor. We've mistaken loudness for strength. We've confused arrogance with confidence. But real masculinity isn't noise. It's weight. It's not about being feared. It's about being trusted. Not about control, but command. Not about power over others, but power over yourself. Because a man who can't master himself will always be mastered by someone else. And that's why the world needs strong men more than ever. Not to dominate, but to stabilize. To protect what's still good. To rebuild what's been broken. The world doesn't crumble because of masculine men. It crumbles when there aren't enough of them. You see, masculinity isn't disappearing. It's reawakening, stripped of its illusions, refined through fire, reborn in silence. And those who tried to bury it are about to learn that you can't kill what's instinctive. Because a man's strength isn't toxic, it's sacred, and it always finds its way back. Section 8. The Awakening. Men are starting to see, Ron Sicko, something is shifting. You can feel it, in the silence, in the unease, in the way men have started to look around again and question everything they were told. The spell is breaking, the shame is wearing off, and what's left underneath is awareness. For years they told men that their instincts were dangerous, that their desire for control was tyranny, that their need for respect was ego, and that their strength was a relic of a darker age. But here's what they never expected, that men would listen long enough to learn the difference between guilt and manipulation. Now men are beginning to see that what was sold to them as progress was really conditioning, that the call for equality quietly turned into a war on identity, and that behind every lecture about toxic masculinity was a deeper message: you are not allowed to define yourself. But men are starting to define themselves again. They're waking up, not in anger, but in clarity. They're realizing they don't need permission to exist. They don't need validation to lead. They don't need approval to feel, because true masculinity doesn't need to be performed. It's lived. It's proven in silence, in sacrifice, in the things no one sees but everyone depends on. Men are seeing how the narrative was built, how it relied on confusion, guilt, and emotional blackmail to keep them compliant. But once a man recognizes that pattern, he can't unsee it. That's the awakening, not rage, not rebellion, just awareness, and awareness is the one thing that can't be controlled. You can shame a man into silence, but you can't shame him once he understands the game. You can take his reputation, but not his purpose. You can destroy his image, but not his instincts. That's what's happening now. Men everywhere, quietly, privately, are waking up, not to fight the world, but to rebuild themselves. They're learning that the greatest revenge is not argument, not outrage, but mastery. To become so grounded, so certain of who they are, that the world's opinion becomes irrelevant. That's the awakening, the shift from guilt to purpose, from silence to clarity, from victimhood to vision. And the truth is, once a man wakes up, you can't put him back to sleep. Section 9. The Truth. Final Reflection. Masculinity was never toxic. It was sacred. It was the structure beneath chaos, the quiet force that held the world together while no one was watching. But somewhere along the line, they made you forget that. They made you believe that the things that made you strong were the things that made you dangerous, that the things that made you a man were the things you should be ashamed of. And for years, you believed it. You softened your voice, you lowered your shoulders, you buried your instincts just to fit into a world that said you were the problem. But here's the truth. They never wanted to fix masculinity. They wanted to redefine it, to make it safe, manageable, harmless. Because a strong man is hard to manipulate. He questions, he resists, he builds, he protects, he leads, and that kind of man threatens every system built on control. That's why they call your strength toxic, because your strength is freedom, and freedom is the one thing they can't manufacture. The truth is simple. Masculinity isn't violence, it's restraint. It isn't dominance, it's direction. It isn't silence, it's discipline. Masculinity is the quiet man who works when no one's watching, the father who sacrifices and never complains, the brother who protects even when no one thanks him, the man who carries pain with grace because he knows the world still needs him strong. That's the part they never show, because it doesn't fit the story. A strong man doesn't make headlines, but he makes foundations. So if you've ever felt small for being a man, if you've ever felt like your nature was a flaw to be corrected, understand this: the world doesn't hate masculinity, it fears it, because when men remember who they are, when they stop apologizing for their instincts, when they stop seeking permission to exist, everything changes. The families get stronger, the communities rebuild, the chaos fades, and order returns. That's what real masculinity is, not control over others, but control over self. Not loud, not desperate, not fragile, just steady, grounded, unbreakable. So no, masculinity isn't toxic. What's toxic is the culture that taught you to be ashamed of it. And now that you know that, you can stop apologizing, because the world doesn't need less masculine men. It needs better ones. It needs stronger ones. It needs men who remember what they were built for, to protect, to build, to endure. And no matter how much they lie, that will never be toxic.